Tokyo, May 5, 1942. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood before a massive table covered in naval charts. His staff officers gathered in tense silence around him. The map showed the entire Pacific Ocean, with markers representing every Japanese and American naval asset. Yamamoto's finger traced a line from Japan to a tiny speck in the central Pacific, Midway Atoll. "Gentlemen, we will draw out the American carriers and destroy them here," he said quietly. "This battle will decide the war." His officers nodded enthusiastically. Japan had won every major engagement since Pearl Harbor. The carrier strike force was undefeated. Victory seemed inevitable, but Yamamoto didn't share their confidence. In private conversations and internal memos, he had said something very different, something that would prove prophetically accurate. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve." And in the weeks before Midway, Yamamoto expressed even darker premonitions. "If we lose our carriers at Midway, we lose the war. There will be no recovery, no second chance." What Isoroku Yamamoto said in the months leading up to Midway, his warnings about American industrial power, his concerns about overextension, his prescient understanding that Japan's early victories were temporary, revealed something extraordinary. The architect of Pearl Harbor knew Japan couldn't win the war he'd started. And at Midway, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, his worst fears would come true in a single catastrophic afternoon that changed the course of World War II. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now relax, grab your coffee, and enjoy this incredible true story. Isoroku Yamamoto was not a typical Japanese militarist. Unlike many of his colleagues who dismissed America as weak and decadent, Yamamoto had lived there. From 1919 to 1921, he studied at Harvard University. From 1926 to 1928, he served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He traveled extensively across America, visiting factories, oil fields, and military installations. What he saw terrified him. In Detroit, Yamamoto toured automobile plants where a single factory produced more vehicles in a day than Japan's entire industry produced in a month. In Pittsburgh, he witnessed steel mills operating on a scale that dwarfed anything in Japan. In Texas, he saw oil wells that made Japan's complete dependence on imported petroleum starkly clear. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas, Yamamoto wrote to a colleague in 1934, knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. When Japanese military leaders began seriously discussing war with the United States in 1940, Yamamoto was one of the few senior officers who opposed it. If ordered to fight, he told Prime Minister Fumimaro Kano in September 1940, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year. After that, I have utterly no confidence." 6 months to a year. That was all Yamamoto believed Japan could sustain offensive operations before American industrial might overwhelm them. It was an astonishingly accurate assessment. Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7, 1941. The Battle of Midway, Japan's decisive defeat, occurred exactly 6 months later, on June 4, 1942. But Yamamoto's warnings were ignored. Japanese military leadership believed their spiritual superiority and fighting skill could overcome any material disadvantage. They believed America lacked the will to fight. They believed one decisive blow would force negotiations. Yamamoto knew better, but as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, when ordered to prepare for war, he obeyed, and he planned Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941, Yamamoto's carrier strike force achieved tactical perfection at Pearl Harbor. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, over 400 Americans killed. Japan's losses, 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. Tokyo celebrated. Military officers declared that American power was broken, that the Pacific now belonged to Japan. That victory was inevitable. But Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Nagato anchored in Hiroshima Bay, showed no jubilation when the reports arrived. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he reportedly said to his chief of staff. Whether Yamamoto actually spoke those exact words is disputed by historians. No contemporary record exists. But the sentiment was authentic. Yamamoto's correspondence and documented statements before and after Pearl Harbor consistently expressed this precise concern. More significantly, Yamamoto immediately recognized Pearl Harbor's critical failure. The American aircraft carriers had been at sea and escaped damage. "The carriers," Yamamoto told his staff, "we must destroy the carriers. Without their carriers, the Americans cannot project power across the Pacific. But if their carriers survive, they remain dangerous." This understanding would drive all of Yamamoto's subsequent strategy. Japan needed to force a decisive engagement with American carriers and destroy them before American industrial production could replace losses. Time was not on Japan's side. Every day America remained in the war, more ships were being built, more aircraft produced, more troops trained. Yamamoto understood the mathematics of industrial warfare better than almost anyone in the Japanese military, and the mathematics were terrifying. January 1942, while Japan celebrated its string of victories, Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Yamamoto was studying American production reports. The numbers were staggering. American shipyards had laid down keels for 15 Essex-class aircraft carriers. Each carrier could hold 90-100 aircraft. They would begin entering service in late 1943. American aircraft factories were producing 4,000 planes monthly and accelerating toward 8,000 monthly by year's end. American submarine construction was producing 2 boats weekly. "We are racing against time," Yamamoto wrote in a February 1942 memo. "Every day that passes makes the enemy stronger. We must force a decisive engagement before their industrial advantage becomes overwhelming." But here, Yamamoto faced an impossible problem. Japanese industrial capacity couldn't keep pace with losses, even when winning. Japan's shipyards could produce approximately 2 carriers per year, and that was working at maximum capacity. America would produce 15 carriers in the same period. Japan could manufacture about 1,500 aircraft monthly. America would produce 8,000. Japan was training replacement pilots at a rate of about 100 per month. America was training over 1,000. The window for Japanese victory was closing rapidly. Yamamoto knew he needed one crushing blow against American carriers to buy time for negotiations. That's why he planned the Midway operation. Admiral Yamamoto's plan for Midway was complex, perhaps too complex. The operation involved nearly every major ship in the Japanese Navy, moving in 8 separate task groups across thousands of miles of ocean. The goals were multiple: capture Midway Atoll, lure American carriers into a trap, destroy those carriers in a decisive battle, and potentially threaten Hawaii itself. But several of Yamamoto's subordinates had concerns. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2, questioned the complexity. "We're dividing our forces across too wide an area. If the Americans know our plans, we could be vulnerable." Commander Minoru Genda, who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, worried about intelligence security. "The Americans have been unusually quiet. What if they're waiting for us?" Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who would command the carrier strike force, was cautious about the entire operation. "We're stretching our logistics to the limit. If anything goes wrong," Yamamoto dismissed these concerns. "The Americans are demoralized. They're scattered across the Pacific. They cannot possibly know our exact plans or coordinate an effective response." But Yamamoto was wrong on every count. Unknown to the Japanese, American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese Naval Code, JN-25. They couldn't read everything, but they could read enough. And they knew Midway was the target. Pearl Harbor, May 1942. Commander Joseph Rochefort led Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's cryptanalysis unit at Pearl Harbor. His team had been working around the clock decrypting Japanese communications. They knew something big was coming. Japanese radio traffic had increased dramatically. References to an operation targeting AF appeared repeatedly. But what was AF? Rochefort believed it was Midway, but he needed proof. So he devised a brilliant ruse. He had Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Days later, Japanese intelligence transmitted, AF is short on fresh water. Proof. AF was Midway. Armed with this intelligence, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet, prepared an ambush. He ordered every available ship to rendezvous near Midway. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown would be waiting when the Japanese arrived. Yamamoto was sailing into a trap, but even as American preparations proceeded, Yamamoto was expressing private doubts about the operation. In a conversation with his chief of staff on May 27th, just before the fleet departed, Yamamoto said quietly, "If we succeed at Midway, we might force negotiations. If we fail, we will have lost our offensive capability. Everything depends on this battle." It was a remarkably clear-eyed assessment. Yamamoto understood that Midway was not just another battle, it was Japan's last real chance to win the war. June 4, 1942, 4:30 a.m. Vice Admiral Nagumo's carrier strike force launched the first wave against Midway, 108 aircraft targeting the atoll's defenses. Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, represented the most experienced, battle-hardened carrier force in the world. These same ships had struck Pearl Harbor, raided across the Indian Ocean, and dominated every engagement. They seemed invincible, but Nagumo didn't know American carriers were already in position, roughly 200 miles northeast of his force. At 5:34 a.m., a PBY Catalina patrol aircraft spotted the Japanese fleet and radioed. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. At 6:03 a.m., radar operators on Midway picked up the incoming strike. Every available aircraft launched to intercept or evacuate. The first Japanese attack hit Midway at 6:30 a.m. The atoll's defenses fought fiercely but were overwhelmed. The Japanese strike commander radioed back, "There is need for a second attack." This message sealed Japan's fate. Nagumo had kept half his aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships, just in case American carriers appeared. When he received the message about Midway needing a second strike, he made a fatal decision: rearm the reserve aircraft with land bombs for attacking Midway. At 7:15 a.m., arming crews began the time-consuming process of switching weapons. At 7:28 a.m., a Japanese scout plane radioed, "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010, distance 240 miles from Midway." Ships, but with their carriers. Nagumo immediately ordered, "Prepare to attack enemy ships. Leave torpedoes on those not yet changed." But the rearming process was already underway. Decks were cluttered with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines. The confusion was immense. At 7:45 a.m., Nagumo received clarification. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. The Americans had a carrier nearby. Nagumo now faced a terrible dilemma. His decks were in chaos. His first strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. His reserve aircraft were half-armed with the wrong weapons. And somewhere out there, American carrier aircraft were probably already inbound. What Nagumo didn't know, 3 American carriers had launched everything they had. Over 150 aircraft were converging on his position. 10:20 a.m. For hours, American attacks had failed. Torpedo bombers from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown had attacked in uncoordinated waves. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore them apart. Of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers that attacked, 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. The sacrifice seemed pointless, but those torpedo bombers had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high altitude undefended. At 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise arrived at 14,000 feet. Below them, they saw the 4 Japanese carriers in a neat formation. Their decks packed with aircraft being fueled and armed. It was a perfect target. "Attack," McCluskey ordered. At 10:25 a.m., 37 dive bombers screamed down toward Akagi and Kaga. At the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown attacked Soryu from a different angle. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Their fighters were still at low altitude pursuing torpedo bombers. Their anti-aircraft fire was scattered and ineffective. The first bomb hit Akagi near the midship elevator at 10:26 a.m. The explosion detonated aircraft fuel and armed bombs on the hangar deck. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. Seconds later, 4 bombs hit Kaga. Massive fires erupted across the flight deck. Soryu took 3 bomb hits in rapid succession. The entire ship became an inferno. In 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were mortally wounded. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, surrounded by flames and smoke, watching his fleet die. He had to be physically dragged away by staff officers as fire consumed the flagship. The 4th carrier, Huryu, had been positioned farther north and escaped the initial attack. She immediately launched strikes that would cripple Yorktown. But by afternoon, American dive bombers found Huryu and destroyed her as well. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or burning wrecks. Japan had lost the core of its carrier striking power. Aboard the battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carrier force, Admiral Yamamoto received fragmentary reports throughout the day. At first, the news was confusing. Radio transmissions spoke of American attacks, of fires, of casualties, but the scale wasn't clear. Then at 10:50 a.m., a message from Akagi: "Fires out of control. Ship listing." Minutes later from Kaga, "Abandoned ship ordered. Soryu, heavy damage, unable to operate." Yamamoto stood at the chart table, his face expressionless as the reports arrived. His staff officers looked to him for direction, for orders, for the decisive action that would salvage the situation. But Yamamoto knew the war was lost. "Order the fleet to withdraw," he said quietly. His chief of staff was stunned. "Sir, we still have overwhelming surface forces. Our battleships, cruisers, we can engage the Americans in night battle." "No," Yamamoto interrupted. "The Americans have won. Without our carriers, we have lost offensive capability. We cannot replace these ships or these pilots. The war—" He paused. "The war is over. We simply don't know it yet." The staff stood in shocked silence. One junior officer, Captain Kurashima, gathered courage to speak. "Admiral, surely we can." Yamamoto turned to face him. "What I told the Prime Minister has come true. I said I could run wild for 6 months. It has been exactly 6 months since Pearl Harbor. Now the Americans will run wild." Yamamoto's assessment was exactly right. Midway was the turning point. Japan would never again conduct major offensive operations. From June 4, 1942 onward, Japan fought a defensive war, losing ground, losing ships, losing pilots, until final surrender in August 1945. The loss at Midway devastated Yamamoto personally. He had been right about everything, about American industrial power, about the time limit on Japanese success, about the impossibility of winning a prolonged war. Being right brought him no satisfaction. In the months after Midway, Yamamoto became withdrawn. Colleagues noted he rarely smiled, rarely engaged in conversation. He had foreseen the disaster, had tried to prevent war, had been overruled, and now watched his predictions come true at the cost of thousands of lives. "I have brought disaster upon my country," he told a close friend in August 1942. "I planned Pearl Harbor believing it would give us negotiating leverage. Instead, it united America against us. I planned Midway hoping to destroy their carriers. Instead, I lost our own. Everything I have done has made Japan's position worse." It was an unusually candid admission for a Japanese military commander. Yamamoto understood that his technical brilliance in planning naval operations couldn't overcome the fundamental strategic reality. Japan couldn't defeat America in an industrial war. But he continued doing his duty, planning operations, managing the increasingly desperate defense of Japan's Pacific territories. Then in April 1943, American intelligence intercepted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message included his exact flight schedule. Admiral Nimitz faced a decision. Should they attempt to assassinate Yamamoto, the operation would be risky. It would reveal that American code-breaking was reading Japanese communications. But Yamamoto was Japan's most capable admiral, and killing him might seriously impact Japanese naval operations. Nimitz authorized the mission. On April 18, 1943, 16 P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport plane near Bougainville and shot it down over the jungle. Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had understood better than any Japanese leader that war with America was unwinnable, died at age 59, killed by the country he had studied, respected, and tried to warn his government not to fight. What Isoroku Yamamoto said before and during the Pacific War was prophetic. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. I can run wild for 6 months or a year. After that, I have utterly no confidence. I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. If we lose our carriers at Midway, we lose the war. Every prediction came true. Yamamoto's tragedy was that he understood the war's outcome before it began. He had the knowledge, the experience, and the perspective to see that Japan's early victories were temporary advantages that would inevitably be overcome by American industrial might. But knowledge without authority to act on that knowledge is worthless. Yamamoto was brilliant enough to understand Japan couldn't win, but he was also a loyal officer who followed orders and planned operations he knew were ultimately futile. The question that haunts Yamamoto's legacy: should he have done more to prevent the war? He opposed it in discussions with civilian leadership. He expressed doubts to his superiors. He provided accurate assessments of American capabilities, but when ordered to prepare for war, he obeyed. And he planned Pearl Harbor brilliantly, setting in motion the exact conflict he knew Japan would lose. Was this duty, loyalty, fatalism, or moral failure? Historians debate this still. Some see Yamamoto as a tragic figure, a voice of reason overwhelmed by militarism. Others see him as complicit in a war he knew was wrong and unwinnable. What's undeniable is that Yamamoto was right about everything that mattered, and being right didn't save him, didn't save Japan, and didn't prevent the war from destroying both. The Battle of Midway was won in 5 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942. But it was lost in the months and years before, when Japanese leadership ignored Yamamoto's warnings about American industrial power and his understanding that early victories would be temporary. Midway proved that material advantages eventually overcome tactical brilliance, that industrial capacity defeats fighting spirit, that mathematics matters more than mythology. Japan's skilled pilots, experienced carriers, and tactical excellence couldn't overcome the fundamental reality. America could build ships faster than Japan could sink them, train pilots faster than Japan could kill them, and produce weapons faster than Japan could destroy them. Yamamoto knew this from the beginning. He said it explicitly. He was ignored. And at Midway, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, exactly as he predicted, Japan's offensive capability died in flames on the decks of 4 burning carriers. What Isoroku Yamamoto said matters because it reminds us that leaders sometimes know the truth but lack the power to act on it, that understanding reality doesn't always prevent disaster, and that sometimes the most tragic figures in history are those who see the catastrophe coming but cannot stop it. Yamamoto planned the attack that started the Pacific War. He predicted how and when Japan would lose it. Both predictions came true. Being right saved no one, not Yamamoto, not Japan, not the millions who died in a war one man understood from the beginning was unwinnable.